On November 15, 2023, maintenance worker Jerome Martinez made a discovery that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the nature of reality itself. While clearing out the abandoned Ellsworth estate in rural Connecticut, Martinez found himself staring at something that shouldn't have been possible. Every mirror in the three-story Victorian mansion had been systematically destroyed from the inside out, their surfaces shattered in perfect spider web patterns that seemed to radiate from a central point where a reflection should have been. What Martinez found next would haunt him for months. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1952, was a collection of photographs spanning nearly a century. Family portraits, candid shots, formal occasions, birthday parties, hundreds of images documenting the lives of the Ellsworth family. In every single photograph, where the faces of the Ellsworth family members should have been, there was nothing but empty space, not torn or damaged, not blurred or obscured, simply absent, as if they had never been there at all. The newspaper clipping wrapped around the photographs bore a headline that made Martinez's blood run cold. Local family vanishes without trace. Mirrors found shattered throughout home. The date on that newspaper was November 15, 1952, exactly 71 years to the day before Martinez made his discovery. But this wasn't the first time the Ellsworth family had vanished, and it wouldn't be the last. I'm Sarah Chen, and for the past 18 months, I've been investigating what can only be described as the most disturbing case of my 15-year career in investigative journalism. What began as research for a routine article about abandoned properties in New England has evolved into something far more sinister, something that challenges our fundamental understanding of existence itself. The story of the Ellsworth family spans over 2 centuries, weaving through American history like a dark thread that should have been cut long ago. It's a story that official records seem determined to erase, that witnesses struggle to remember clearly, and that leaves behind evidence so impossible that most investigators simply choose to ignore it. But the evidence is there, hidden in forgotten archives, buried in old police reports, whispered in the testimonies of those brave enough to speak. The Ellsworth family has been vanishing and reappearing in cycles for over 200 years, and each time they return, the world around them becomes a little more wrong. What you're about to hear may sound like fiction. I wish it were. But every fact has been verified, every witness interviewed, every document authenticated. The truth about the Ellsworths isn't just stranger than fiction, it's stranger than anything fiction would dare to imagine. The earliest record of the Ellsworth family dates back to 1823, when Nathaniel Ellsworth purchased a plot of land in what is now rural Connecticut for the sum of $3. Local records describe this as an unusually low price, even for the time. The land had been owned previously by a family named Morrison, who had abandoned it suddenly 3 years earlier, under circumstances that the town records describe only as most peculiar. Nathaniel Ellsworth was described by his contemporaries as an unremarkable man, average height, average build, with what one neighbor called the kind of face you forget the moment you look away. He arrived in town with a wife, Martha, and 2 young children, Thomas and Elizabeth. The family kept to themselves, which wasn't unusual for the time, but neighbors began to notice something odd about the Ellsworths almost immediately. Reverend Jonathan Hayes, who served the local parish from 1820 to 1847, kept detailed journals of his daily life and the families in his congregation. In an entry dated September 12, 1823, he wrote, "Called upon the new family, the Ellsworths, to welcome them to our community. Most strange encounter. Could speak with them plainly enough, but found myself unable to recall their faces the moment I looked away. When I attempted to describe them to my wife upon returning home, I found I could remember nothing of their appearance save that they were present." Reverend Hayes wasn't the only one to notice this peculiarity. Dr. Samuel Morton, the town's physician, noted in his medical records that he had been called to treat various members of the Ellsworth family on multiple occasions, but could never remember what treatments he had provided or even what ailments he had supposedly cured. His notes from that period are filled with incomplete entries that simply state attended to Ellsworth's family, with no further details. The first disappearance occurred in the winter of 1824. According to town records, the Ellsworth family simply stopped appearing in public. No one saw them at church, at the general store, or anywhere else in town. When concerned neighbors finally approached their property in early spring of 1825, they found the house completely empty, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Personal belongings remained exactly where they had been left, including family portraits hanging on the walls. But there was something wrong with those portraits. Every single painting showed empty chairs, vacant backgrounds, elaborate frames surrounding nothing at all. The brushwork was exquisite, the detail immaculate, but where the family members should have been depicted, there was simply empty space. Local authorities conducted what records describe as a thorough investigation, but their reports contain only fragments. Sheriff William Garrett's notes mention discovering evidence of habitation but no evidence of inhabitants, and refer repeatedly to the mirror situation without ever explaining what that phrase meant. The investigation was closed after 3 weeks with no resolution. The house remained empty for exactly 25 years. In 1850, the Ellsworth property was purchased by a family calling themselves the Ellsworths. Local records showed that the deed was signed by one Nathaniel Ellsworth, described as the heir and successor to the previous Nathaniel Ellsworth. This new Nathaniel appeared to be the same age as the original owner had been when he first arrived in 1823, and was accompanied by a wife named Martha and 2 children, Thomas and Elizabeth. The townspeople who remembered the original family noted the resemblance immediately, but also noted something else. While the new arrivals bore the same names and seemed to be of the same ages, no one could quite remember what the original family had looked like well enough to make a proper comparison. Merchant James Crawford wrote in a letter to his brother in Boston, "The new Ellsworths have taken residence in the old place. Strange thing is, they look familiar, but I cannot say how. It's as if I'm seeing people I should know but don't, or perhaps people I once knew but have forgotten." Sarah insists they are entirely different from the previous family, but when I ask her to describe the differences, she finds herself at a loss for words. This second generation of Ellsworths followed the same pattern as the first. They kept largely to themselves, conducted their business quietly and efficiently, and left virtually no impression on anyone they encountered. Children would play near their property but could never remember doing so afterward. Adults would have conversations with family members but found themselves unable to recall the substance of those conversations within hours. Dr. Morton's son, who had taken over his father's practice, began keeping more detailed records during this period. In a note dated June 3, 1852, he wrote, "I have been treating members of the Ellsworth family for various ailments over the past 2 years, yet I cannot for the life of me remember a single instance of these treatments. My appointment book clearly shows multiple visits, and my medical supplies indicate that treatments were indeed provided, but I have no memory of the encounters themselves. Most disturbing of all, I cannot recall what any of the family members look like, despite having presumably examined them physically. The second disappearance came exactly 25 years after the first family had vanished. In the winter of 1850, the Ellsworths stopped appearing in town. When neighbors investigated the following spring, they found the same situation as before, an empty house with all possessions intact, including family portraits that showed only empty spaces where faces should have been. But this time, there was something new. Every mirror in the house had been found shattered, not broken from impact, but fractured in perfect geometric patterns that seemed to radiate outward from the center of each mirror's surface. The glass fragments were still in place, held together by some unknown force, creating web-like patterns that distorted light in impossible ways. Sheriff David Morrison, William Garrett's successor, documented this discovery in reports that still exist in the county archives. Morrison wrote, "The mirrors present a most puzzling sight. Each one appears to have been broken from within, as if something struck them from behind the glass, yet the fragments remain suspended in their frames, creating patterns that hurt the eyes to look upon. When one attempts to see one's reflection in these damaged mirrors, no reflection appears at all. We tested this phenomenon with multiple witnesses present, all of whom confirmed that the mirrors show nothing when looked into. The investigation into the second disappearance was even briefer than the first. Sheriff Morrison's final report, filed just 1 week after the discovery, contains only a single line: matter concluded. No further action required. The house remained empty for exactly 25 years. By the time the third generation of Ellsworths arrived in 1875, some members of the community had begun to notice the pattern. Thomas Garrett, son of the original Sheriff William Garrett, had grown up hearing stories of the first disappearance and was present for the second, when the new family appeared, bearing the same names and apparent ages as their predecessors. Garrett began keeping detailed records of his own. Unlike the official authorities, Garrett was not content to let the matter rest. He interviewed elderly residents who had known both previous generations of Ellsworths, compiled timelines, and even attempted to research the family's origins. What he discovered was deeply disturbing. In his private journal, Garrett wrote, "Have traced the Ellsworth name back through multiple counties and states, following property records and census data. What I have found defies explanation. There are records of Ellsworth families appearing and disappearing in locations across New England for the past century. Always following the same pattern. A family arrives, lives quietly for years, then vanishes completely, leaving behind empty houses and shattered mirrors. After exactly 25 years, a new generation appears, bearing the same names and ages as the previous one." Garrett's research revealed accounts from Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire of families matching the Ellsworth description. In each case, local authorities had investigated the disappearances and closed the cases quickly with minimal documentation. In each case, witnesses described the same inability to remember the family members' faces or maintain clear memories of interactions with them. But Garrett discovered something else that chilled him to the bone. In every location where an Ellsworth family had disappeared, there were reports of strange phenomena in the years following their vanishing. Residents would catch glimpses of people in mirrors who weren't in the room. Photographs would develop, with extra figures that no one remembered being present when the pictures were taken. Children would insist they had imaginary friends who looked like the missing family members, describing them in detail despite having never seen them. Most disturbing of all, Garrett found documentation of what happened to people who tried to investigate the Ellsworths too deeply. Dr. Morton's detailed medical records stopped abruptly in 1853. Replaced by increasingly brief and confused notes. His son later reported that his father had begun suffering from what he called memory troubles and would often be found staring into mirrors for hours at a time, insisting that someone was looking back at him. That Reverend Hayes's journals ended in 1847 with an entry that simply read, "I see them now. In every reflection, they are trying to come back through the glass. God help us all." Hayes was found 3 days later in his church, standing in front of the altar's polished brass cross, staring at his own reflection. He never spoke again, and died 2 years later in a state institution. The third generation of Ellsworths arrived on schedule in 1875, and Thomas Garrett was waiting for them. He had prepared extensively, setting up observation posts around the property and recruiting trusted friends to help document everything about the family's stay. What they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Unlike previous generations, Garrett and his associates made a systematic effort to study the Ellsworths. They followed family members at a distance, attempted to photograph them, and even tried to engage them in extended conversations while taking detailed notes immediately afterward. The results were disturbing. Despite multiple attempts, no photograph of an Ellsworth family member ever developed properly. The images would show clothing, background details, and even shadows cast by the family members, but the people themselves appeared as empty spaces in the photographs. When Garrett's associate, photographer William Mason, attempted to explain this phenomenon, he found himself unable to remember the specifics of each photography session, despite his detailed notes proving that the sessions had taken place. Conversations with the Ellsworths yielded even more troubling results. Garrett's notes from this period show that he managed to have several lengthy discussions with Nathaniel Ellsworth about farming, weather, and local politics. According to his immediately written transcripts, these conversations were normal and unremarkable, but when Garrett read his own notes just hours later, he found that while he had recorded Nathaniel's words accurately, he couldn't remember what the man's voice had sounded like or even recall the conversation taking place. The most significant breakthrough came when Garrett attempted to observe the family's reflections in mirrors. Working with his associate doctor, Henry Russell, they positioned themselves where they could see both the Ellsworths and their reflections in the large mirror that hung in the general store. What they saw violated everything they thought they knew about the world, Garrett wrote in his journal. Dr. Russell and I positioned ourselves carefully so that we could observe both Nathaniel Ellsworth and his reflection as he conducted business. With the store owner, what we witnessed defies rational explanation. While Nathaniel stood clearly before the mirror, no reflection appeared in the glass. Not a darkened reflection, not a blurred reflection, but no reflection at all. The mirror showed only the wall behind him, as if he were not there. Yet he cast a shadow, and his presence was clearly felt by all in the room. Dr. Russell, a man of science who had initially been skeptical of Garrett's theories, wrote his own account of this incident. "I have witnessed something that challenges my understanding of the physical world. The human eye can see Nathaniel Ellsworth clearly, but mirrors cannot reflect his image. When I attempted to observe other family members, the same phenomenon occurred. They exist in our reality, but not in the reality of reflections. I am at a loss to explain how this is possible, but the most terrifying discovery was yet to come." While conducting their observations, Garrett and his associates began to notice that their own reflections were changing. At first, the changes were subtle. Their faces would appear slightly different in mirrors, their expressions more serious, their eyes somehow older. But as they continued their investigation, the changes became more pronounced. Garrett's wife, Eleanor, reported that her husband's reflection had begun to look like someone else entirely, someone she couldn't quite recognize but who seemed familiar, in a deeply unsettling way. Dr. Russell's reflection developed the same problem, showing a face that was his but somehow wasn't, as if someone else were wearing his features. As the third generation of Ellsworths continued their stay, Garrett and his associates uncovered more disturbing evidence. They discovered that the family never ate food in public, never seemed to age even slightly over the years, and never left any physical traces of their presence despite clearly being there. Mary Patterson, who ran the local boarding house, reported a particularly unsettling encounter with Martha Ellsworth. She came to inquire about rooms for visiting relatives, though I later realized no relatives ever arrived. During our conversation, I kept looking at her face, but I couldn't seem to hold on to what I was seeing. It was as if my eyes could see her clearly enough, but my mind refused to form a memory of her appearance. When she left, I found myself unable to recall anything about what she looked like, though I remembered every word she had spoken. The children, Thomas and Elizabeth, presented their own mysteries. Schoolteacher Rebecca Morrison noted that both children attended classes regularly and participated in lessons, but left no impression on their classmates. In her records, Morrison wrote, "The Ellsworth children are present every day, complete their assignments satisfactorily, and cause no disruptions. Yet when I ask other students about them, the children seem confused, as if they cannot quite remember who I am referring to. When I attempt to describe Thomas or Elizabeth's appearance, I find myself unable to do so, despite having looked at them directly moments before." More disturbing still were the reports from other children in the community. Several parents noted that their children had begun talking about new friends named Thomas and Elizabeth, describing elaborate games and conversations. But when questioned, the children could never explain where these friends lived or arrange for their parents to meet them. Some children insisted that Thomas and Elizabeth only appeared when no adults were around, and would vanish the moment a grown-up entered the room. Dr. Russell began conducting what he called systematic observations of the phenomenon, attempting to apply scientific methodology to something that seemed to exist outside the bounds of known science. His notes from this period provide some of the most detailed accounts we have of the Ellsworth family's impossible nature. Russell wrote, "I have determined that the Ellsworth family members exist in what I can only describe as a state of partial reality. They can be seen, heard, and interacted with, but they leave no lasting impression on the world around them. Food they supposedly eat is never actually consumed, though observers swear they witness the consumption. Money they pay for goods vanishes from cash registers within hours, though merchants remember conducting the transactions. Most remarkably, any attempt to create a permanent record of their existence fails. Photographs show empty space, written descriptions become illegible within days, and even detailed notes taken immediately after interactions become confused and contradictory when read later." But Russell's most significant discovery came when he attempted to follow the family members home one evening. Hidden in the woods near the Ellsworth property, he watched as the family approached their house at sunset. What he saw would haunt him until his death. Decades later, Russell's journal entry for November 3, 1882, reads, "I have witnessed something that I struggle to put into words. As the Ellsworth family approached their home this evening, I observed them clearly through my field glasses. But as they crossed the threshold of their house, they seemed to fade, becoming translucent and then invisible. Yet lights appeared in the windows, and I could hear sounds of normal domestic activity from within. When I crept closer to peer through the windows, I saw furniture moving by itself, doors opening and closing, and meals being prepared by invisible hands. The family was there, conducting their evening routine, but they could not be seen." This discovery led Russell to a horrifying conclusion, one that he documented in a sealed letter that wasn't opened until after his death in 1923. In this letter, Russell wrote, "I believe the Ellsworth family exists primarily in the world of reflections, in the reality that exists behind mirrors. They can manifest in our world temporarily, but their true existence takes place in that other realm. This would explain why they cast no reflections. They are the reflections, somehow, existing independently of their sources. God help me, I believe they are trying to switch places with us, to escape their reflected world and trap us in their place." As 1900 approached, marking the end of the third generation's 25-year cycle, Thomas Garrett and his associates prepared for what they believed would be the family's disappearance. They had documented everything meticulously, gathered physical evidence, and recruited witnesses from neighboring towns to verify their findings. They were confident that this time the Ellsworth mystery would finally be solved. They were wrong. November 15, 1899, exactly 1 year before the expected disappearance, Thomas Garrett vanished from his home. His wife Eleanor reported that she had seen him enter his study after dinner to work on his Ellsworth research. But when she went to check on him an hour later, the room was empty. His research materials remained on his desk, his coat hung on its hook, and there were no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Most unsettling of all, when Eleanor looked into the mirror above her husband's desk, she saw Thomas Garrett's reflection staring back at her, even though he was not in the room. The reflection mouthed words she couldn't hear and gestured frantically, as if trying to warn her about something. When she reached toward the mirror, the reflection shook its head violently and backed away, disappearing into the reflected depths of the glass. Dr. Russell disappeared 3 days later under similar circumstances. His housekeeper found his laboratory empty despite having seen him enter just minutes before. Like Garrett, Russell's reflection appeared in the laboratory's mirrors, but his physical form was nowhere to be found. The housekeeper reported that Russell's reflection looked terrified and kept pointing toward something outside the reflected room's windows, something that wasn't visible in the real world. William Mason, the photographer, vanished on November 20th. His assistant reported finding Mason's darkroom empty except for a single photograph, developing in the chemical baths. The photograph showed Mason standing in what appeared to be a reversed version of his darkroom, surrounded by figures the assistant couldn't quite make out but which filled him with inexplicable dread. One by one, everyone who had investigated the Ellsworth family too closely began to disappear. They didn't leave their homes, didn't pack bags, didn't say goodbye to loved ones. They simply stepped from the real world into the world of reflections, leaving behind only their images trapped in mirrors and glass surfaces. Eleanor Garrett spent months trying to communicate with her husband's reflection, holding written messages up to mirrors and watching as his reflected image responded with gestures and expressions. Through this painstaking process, she managed to understand that Thomas and the others were trapped in what he called the other side, a reversed world that existed behind every reflective surface. According to Eleanor's journal, Thomas's reflection tried to warn her that the Ellsworth family was not disappearing at the end of their cycles. They were recruiting. Each 25-year period, they would select individuals who had learned too much about their true nature and drag them into the reflected world, taking their places in reality. The people who disappeared weren't victims of the mystery, they were becoming part of it. When the fourth generation of Ellsworths arrived in 1900, they came to a community that was terrified and suspicious. Too many people had vanished during the previous cycle, and too many residents had witnessed impossible things in mirrors. The town's new sheriff, Robert Hayes, son of the reverend who had investigated the first generation, was determined not to let history repeat itself. Sheriff Hayes took a different approach than his predecessors. Instead of trying to investigate the Ellsworth family directly, he focused on protecting the community from them. He ordered that all mirrors in public buildings be covered with black cloth, banned the sale of new mirrors in town, and established a system of buddy watching, when no one was allowed to be alone with a reflective surface for extended periods. These precautions seemed to frustrate the fourth generation of Ellsworths in ways that previous generations had never been frustrated. Martha Ellsworth was reported to have grown increasingly agitated when she found the covered mirrors in the general store, demanding to know why they were hidden. When told it was for safety reasons, she reportedly laughed in a way that made everyone present deeply uncomfortable. The children, Thomas and Elizabeth, began exhibiting more aggressive behavior than previous generations had shown. They would appear in other children's rooms at night, visible only in bedroom mirrors, trying to convince their real-world counterparts to touch the glass. Several parents reported finding their children standing before mirrors in the middle of the night, their hands pressed against the surface. Speaking to reflections that weren't their own, Dr. Edward Blackwood, who had replaced Dr. Russell, documented these incidents in reports that still exist in the county medical files. Blackwood wrote, "I have treated 7 children in the past month for what I can only describe as mirror fixation. These children, all between the ages of 6 and 12, have begun displaying an obsessive fascination with their own reflections. They spend hours staring into mirrors, carrying on conversations with images that other observers cannot see. Most disturbing of all, several parents have reported that their children's reflections sometimes move independently, making gestures and expressions that don't match the children's actual movements." But Sheriff Hayes's precautions had an unexpected consequence by limiting the Ellsworth family's access to mirrors and reflective surfaces. He had inadvertently trapped them more fully in the physical world, without their normal ability to move freely between reality and reflection. The family began to show signs of deterioration. Townspeople reported that the Ellsworths were becoming more visible, more present, but also more wrong. Their faces, which had always been difficult to remember, began to show clear features, but features that didn't quite fit together properly. Nathaniel Ellsworth's eyes were reported to be different colors from day to day. Martha's hair would change length. Between morning and afternoon, the children's ages seemed to fluctuate, sometimes appearing younger, sometimes older, as if they couldn't maintain a consistent physical form. Most disturbing of all, the family began to cast reflections again. But these reflections showed them, as they truly were, ancient, withered creatures with empty eye sockets and mouths full of broken mirror fragments. When townspeople caught glimpses of these true reflections, they would often suffer what Dr. Blackwood termed reflection shock, a condition characterized by temporary paralysis, nightmares, and an overwhelming urge to avoid all reflective surfaces. By 1910, the situation in town had escalated into what local historians would later refer to as the War of Mirrors. The Ellsworth family, cut off from their reflected realm by Sheriff Hayes's precautions, had begun actively hunting for new reflective surfaces to exploit. They started small, using the surfaces of still water, polished metal, and even the eyes of townspeople to create temporary connections to their other world. But as their desperation grew, their methods became more aggressive and disturbing. Owner Marcus Webb reported finding his shop's windows had been mysteriously polished to a mirror-like shine overnight. Despite having locked the building securely, when he looked through these super-reflective windows the next morning, he saw not the street outside, but a reversed version of his store where shadowy figures moved among the merchandise. The figures beckoned to him, and Webb found himself walking toward the window with his hand outstretched before his assistant arrived and pulled him away. Similar incidents occurred throughout the town. Residents would wake to find that every piece of glass in their homes had been polished to perfect reflectivity. Children reported that puddles in the street would show not the sky above, but underground caverns where pale figures waited. Even the brass doorknobs in the church began reflecting images that had nothing to do with the room they were in. Sheriff Hayes realized that his strategy of simply covering mirrors wasn't enough. The Ellsworth family was creating new gateways wherever they could. In response, he organized what he called reflection raids, where teams of volunteers would go through the town each night, dulling every reflective surface they could find with sand, soap, or paint. But the Ellsworths fought back. People who participated in the reflection raids began disappearing, not into mirrors this time, but simply vanishing while walking down familiar streets or sitting in their own homes. Unlike previous disappearances, these people left no reflections behind. They were simply gone, as if they had never existed at all. Dr. Blackwood documented one such disappearance in detail. Hardware store owner James Morrison had been helping to dull the reflective surfaces of shop windows when witnesses saw him simply fade away, becoming transparent and then invisible while standing in broad daylight on Main Street. The witnesses reported that as Morrison disappeared, they found it increasingly difficult to remember who he was or why they had been talking to him. By the time he was completely gone, no one could recall his name, or even that someone had been standing there moments before. The war escalated when Nathaniel Ellsworth began appearing at town meetings, demanding that the mirror coverings be removed and the reflection raids stopped. But now, trapped more fully in the physical world, his words carried a weight they had never possessed before. People found themselves agreeing with him despite their fear, nodding along to arguments they couldn't quite understand. During one particularly tense meeting, Martha Ellsworth stood up and declared, "You cannot keep us from our rightful place forever. We have been patient, we have been subtle, but our patience has limits. Give us what we require, or we will take it from you in ways you cannot imagine." When asked what exactly they required, Nathaniel replied, "Passage, reflection, the right to exist in the world that should have been ours from the beginning. We are tired of living in your shadows. It is time for us to step into the light, and for you to take your place behind the glass." In the chaos of the War of Mirrors, some of the town's children began to provide the most important testimony about the true nature of the Ellsworth family, unlike adults, who seemed to forget or confuse their experiences with the Ellsworths. Children retained clear memories and spoke about them with disturbing clarity. 8-year-old Sarah Morrison told her parents, "Thomas and Elizabeth aren't like us. They're made of mirror pieces. When they talk, their voices come from behind my eyes instead of through my ears. They showed me where they really live. It's in the place where all the mirrors connect to each other. It's like our world but backwards, and everything there is made of broken glass." 10-year-old Michael Webb provided even more specific information. "The mirror children told me that they used to be like us, but they got lost behind a looking glass a long time ago. Now they can't get out unless someone else takes their place. They've been trying to trade places with people for a really long time, but grown-ups are too hard to trick. That's why they need kids. We can see them better, and we don't know it's wrong to touch the mirror when they ask us to." Most disturbing of all was the testimony of 6-year-old Emma Patterson, who had spent more time interacting with the children than any other child in town. Emma told Dr. Blackwood, "Elizabeth showed me the mirror place. It's full of people who look like they're sleeping, but their eyes are open. She said they're all the people who helped her family before. She said they're happy there because they don't have to remember being scared anymore. She asked me if I wanted to be happy like that too." When Dr. Blackwood asked Emma how Elizabeth had shown her this place, the child replied, "In my bedroom mirror, but not the regular way. Elizabeth came out of the mirror and took my hand, and then we went back in together. It felt like falling upward. The people there all looked familiar, but I couldn't remember where I'd seen them before." Elizabeth said that's because they weren't really people anymore. They were memories wearing people's shapes. These children's accounts provided the first clear picture of what the Ellsworth family truly was and what they wanted. They were not ghosts or spirits in any traditional sense, but beings that existed primarily in the reflected world, feeding on human memory and presence to maintain their own existence. Each 25-year cycle wasn't just about disappearing and reappearing, it was about harvesting enough human essence to sustain themselves for another generation. That the children also revealed that the Ellsworth family was far older than anyone had realized. According to Elizabeth Ellsworth speaking through Emma Patterson, their family had been collecting people for over 300 years, moving from town to town across New England and beyond. The 25-year cycles weren't natural, they were the maximum length of time. The family could maintain physical forms before needing to retreat to the mirror world to regenerate. But something had gone wrong during this current cycle. Sheriff Hayes's mirror covering campaign had not only trapped the family in the physical world longer than ever before, but had also cut them off from their stored collection of absorbed people. The beings they had captured over the centuries were trapped in the mirror world without connection to their captors, and the Ellsworth family was slowly starving without access to their energy. By 1915, the situation had reached a critical point. The Ellsworth family, now trapped in the physical world for 15 years without access to their mirror realm, had begun to show signs of severe deterioration. Their attempts to maintain human appearance were failing, and townspeople could no longer deny what they were seeing. Nathaniel Ellsworth's face had begun to collapse inward, revealing that beneath the skin was not flesh and bone, but a hollow cavity filled with mirror fragments. Martha's hair had turned completely white and had begun falling out in clumps, each strand shattering like spun glass when it hit the ground. The children had stopped attending school altogether after their teacher reported that their faces would sometimes become completely transparent, showing the classroom wall behind them. Dr. Blackwood documented these changes in increasingly frantic medical reports. The Ellsworth family is undergoing some form of physical breakdown that defies medical explanation. Their bodies appear to be constructed of some unknown material that mimics human tissue but lacks the underlying biological structure. As this material deteriorates, they are becoming less human and more something else entirely. The family's behavior had also become increasingly erratic and desperate. They were now openly approaching townspeople in broad daylight, pleading for access to mirrors and reflective surfaces. Martha Ellsworth was reported to have grabbed Mrs. Henderson by the shoulders outside the general store, begging her to look into her eyes so that she could see herself properly again. But the most terrifying development was that the family had begun to fragment, literally. Pieces of them would sometimes separate from their bodies and move independently. Witnesses reported seeing Nathaniel's shadow walking down Main Street, while his body remained visible standing outside the bank. Martha's reflection was spotted in store windows even when she wasn't present, going through the motions of shopping in the reflected world while her physical form was elsewhere. The children had become almost completely invisible, existing as little more than voices and the occasional glimpse of movement in peripheral vision. But their voices had grown stronger and more persuasive, able to convince other children to do things that put them in danger. Several families reported finding their children standing on chairs in front of high windows, trying to see their reflections in the glass, while invisible voices encouraged them to lean closer. Sheriff Hayes realized that the situation was becoming untenable. The town couldn't maintain the mirror restrictions indefinitely, and the Ellsworth family's deterioration was making them more dangerous, not less. He began to consider the unthinkable, giving the family what they wanted in hopes that they would complete their cycle and leave. But Dr. Blackwood had made a discovery that changed everything. While researching the family's history in old medical texts, he had found a reference to a similar case from colonial times. A physician in Salem had documented the treatment of a family that existed betwixt the world of flesh and the world of glass, and had discovered a way to trap them permanently. According to the colonial physician's notes, beings like the Ellsworth family could be defeated by creating what he called a mirror trap, a reflective surface that showed not what was in front of it, but what was behind it. Such a mirror would confuse the being's connection to the reflected world, and trap them in a state of existence where they could neither fully manifest in reality, nor retreat to their mirror realm. Dr. Blackwood spent weeks working with the town's glassmaker to create such a mirror, using techniques described in the colonial physician's coded notes. The process involved silver that had been blessed by clergy, glass that had been forged in fires fed by wood from holy buildings, and a specific arrangement of angles that would create the reverse reflection effect. The completed mirror was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Looking into it showed not your reflection, but what appeared to be the back of your own head. The effect was deeply disorienting and unsettling, but Dr. Blackwood was confident it would work. On November 15, 1920, exactly 25 years after the fourth generation had arrived, Sheriff Hayes and Dr. Blackwood put their plan into action. They had chosen this date specifically, knowing that the Ellsworth family would be at their most vulnerable as their cycle came to an end, and their connection to the physical world weakened. The trap was set in the town's church, the one building, large enough to contain the mirror trap while providing multiple exit points if the plan failed. Dr. Blackwood's reverse mirror was positioned at the altar, covered with black cloth until the moment of revelation. Getting the Ellsworth family to the church required a deception. Sheriff Hayes announced publicly that the town council had decided to lift all restrictions on mirrors and reflective surfaces, and that a special ceremony would be held to restore the natural order with the unveiling of a ceremonial mirror that would allow the family to return to their rightful place. The Ellsworth family arrived at sunset, looking more desperate and deteriorated than ever. Nathaniel's hollow face was partially collapsed, showing the mirror fragments that made up his internal structure. Martha appeared to be held together by nothing more than force of will, her form flickering between solid and translucent. The children were barely visible at all, existing as little more than whispers and cold spots in the air, as the townsfolk gathered every adult who remained in the community, armed with whatever they could carry. Dr. Blackwood gave a speech about the importance of reflection and truth. The Ellsworth family stood near the altar, clearly sensing that something was different, but unable to determine what. When Dr. Blackwood pulled the cloth from the reverse mirror, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Ellsworth family froze in place, their forms beginning to flicker and distort as they tried to understand what they were seeing in the impossible reflection. The mirror showed them as they truly were, ancient twisted creatures made of broken glass and stolen memories, but from an angle that their minds couldn't process. Nathaniel screamed, a sound like glass breaking in reverse, and lunged toward the mirror, but as he moved closer, his form began to stretch and distort, pulled between the physical world and the reflected world without being able to enter either fully. Martha and the children suffered the same fate, their bodies becoming elongated and twisted as they were caught in the space between realities. For a moment, it seemed the plan had worked. The family was trapped, unable to move forward or backward, frozen in a state of impossible existence. But then something unexpected happened. The reverse mirror began to crack, not from impact but from the strain of holding beings that were never meant to exist in the physical world. As the cracks spread across the mirror's surface, other reflective surfaces throughout the church began to crack as well. The brass cross, the windows, even the polished wood surfaces started showing the same spiderweb patterns that had been found in the Ellsworth house after previous disappearances. Dr. Blackwood realized with growing horror that the trap wasn't containing the Ellsworth family, it was shattering the barrier between the physical world and the mirror world entirely. Through the cracks in reality, he could see the other side, filled with the pale figures of everyone the family had collected over the centuries. They were all standing there, pressing against the broken boundaries, trying to escape back into reality. Sheriff Hayes shouted for everyone to evacuate the church, but it was too late. The reverse mirror exploded outward, sending fragments of impossible glass throughout the building. Each fragment showed a different reflection. Some showed the church as it was, others showed it in reverse, and still others showed places and times that didn't exist. That in the chaos that followed, witnesses reported seeing multiple versions of the Ellsworth family scattered throughout the building, some solid, some transparent, some existing only as reflections without sources. They moved independently of each other, as if the family had been split across multiple realities and was trying to reassemble itself. The last clear account of what happened in the church comes from young Emma Patterson, who had hidden in the bell tower and watched the events unfold. According to Emma, as the mirror world and physical world collided, she saw hundreds of figures emerging from the broken reflections, all the people the Ellsworth family had collected over the centuries, finally freed but changed by their imprisonment. Liberated figures moved through the church like sleepwalkers, their faces blank and their movements mechanical. They seemed to be searching for something, touching surfaces and looking into the remaining mirror fragments as if trying to remember who they were. Some of them looked familiar to Emma. She recognized faces from old photographs and paintings in the town's historical society, people who had lived and died decades or even centuries ago. But the most terrifying sight was the Ellsworth family themselves. No longer constrained by the need to appear human, they had revealed their true forms. They weren't people at all, but wounds in reality itself, dark spaces where existence had been torn away. They moved through the church like living voids, absorbing light and sound and memory from everything they touched. The church burned to the ground that night, though no one could explain how the fire started or why it burned with flames that cast no light. By morning, nothing remained but a circular patch of scorched earth that refused to grow grass or support any form of life. The Ellsworth family was gone, but so were 47 residents of the town. Unlike previous disappearances, these people hadn't been taken into the mirror world. They had simply ceased to exist. Their homes remained, their possessions were undisturbed, but it was as if they had been erased from reality itself. Even more disturbing, within days of their disappearance, no one could remember who they had been. Their names faded from documents, their faces became unrecognizable in photographs, and their loved ones found themselves unable to recall that these people had ever existed. Dr. Blackwood was among those who vanished. His final medical report, written hours before the confrontation at the church, was found on his desk the next morning, but the handwriting became illegible as the words were read. The last coherent line stated, "I fear we have not destroyed the Ellsworth family, but rather freed them from the constraints that limited their power. God help us all." Sheriff Hayes survived the events at the church, but he was found 3 days later in his office, staring into a hand mirror and speaking to his own reflection as if it were another person. When concerned citizens tried to take the mirror away, Hayes became violent, insisting that his reflection was giving him important information about the new arrangements. Hayes lived for another 15 years, but he was never the same. He would spend hours each day holding conversations with mirrors, claiming that he was coordinating with law enforcement officials in the reflected territories to manage the aftermath of what he called the Great Convergence. When asked to explain what he meant, Hayes would smile and say that the mirror world and the physical world were no longer separate, and that new rules applied now. The town itself began to change in the months following the church incident. Residents reported that their reflections would sometimes move independently, performing actions they weren't doing. Children claimed that their bedroom mirrors showed different rooms at night, places that looked like their bedrooms but weren't quite right. Adults found themselves having conversations with people who seemed familiar but whom they couldn't identify, only to realize later that they had been talking to their own reflections. Most disturbing of all, new people began appearing in town. People who insisted they had lived there all their lives but whom no one could remember. These individuals had all the proper documentation. Their names appeared in records that people swore hadn't been there before. and they knew intimate details about the community's history. More disturbing still, when she compared current records with older ones, she found that the names on the population rolls were gradually changing. People she remembered from her childhood were being replaced in the records by individuals with similar but not identical names. The Morrisons became the Moransons, the Webbs became the Webbers, and the Pattersons became the Pattersons. The changes were subtle enough that most people didn't notice, but consistent enough to suggest a deliberate pattern. Agnes realized that the Ellsworth family wasn't just altering reality, they were gradually replacing it with a version of their own design. The hybrid residents weren't random amalgamations of people from different realities, they were carefully constructed individuals designed to fit into a new narrative. But the family was writing for the town. This discovery led to an even more horrifying realization. If the family could rewrite the town's population, they could potentially rewrite its entire history. They could eliminate any record of their own supernatural nature, transforming themselves in the historical record from reality parasites into ordinary citizens who had always lived in the community. Agnes shared this information with the other consistency keepers, and they made a desperate decision. They would create a complete record of the true events, hiding copies in multiple locations and using techniques designed to resist the family's reality-altering abilities. Each record would be written in a different style and stored in a different medium, making it impossible for the family to alter all of them simultaneously. Sarah Morrison wrote her account in the form of a journal, dating each entry and including specific details that could be verified against physical evidence. Dr. Sullivan created medical case files that documented the psychological effects of reality distortion, using clinical language that would be difficult to alter without making the documents obviously fraudulent. Robert Hayes compiled police reports and witness statements, organizing them chronologically to show the progression of events. Agnes Morrison took on the most dangerous task of all. She decided to confront the Ellsworth family directly, not to fight them, but to negotiate. She would offer them a deal. They could continue to exist in the town and gradually alter its reality, but they had to allow the true records to survive in some form. She would argue that they needed witnesses to their victory, people who could appreciate the scope of their achievement. Agnes arranged to meet with Nathaniel Ellsworth at the site where the church had once stood. The ground there still refused to support life, but it had become a gathering place for the hybrid residents, who would stand in a circle around the scorched earth each evening at sunset. When Agnes arrived for the meeting, she found Nathaniel waiting for her, but this wasn't the deteriorated, hollow figure that witnesses had described from the church confrontation. This Nathaniel appeared fully human, healthy and robust, wearing clothes that suggested prosperity and respectability. Only his eyes gave away his true nature. They reflected light that wasn't there, showing images of places that couldn't be seen. Agnes later wrote that Nathaniel listened to her proposal with what seemed like genuine interest. He explained that the family had indeed been working to gradually replace the town's reality with one of their own design, but that they had encountered an unexpected problem. The process was taking much longer than anticipated because the original reality was more resilient than they had expected. Nathaniel revealed that the consistency keepers' efforts had been more effective than they realized. By insisting on the truth of their memories and creating anchor points throughout the town, they had been slowing the family's progress significantly. What should have been completed in a few years was now projected to take decades. But Nathaniel also revealed something that horrified Agnes. The family didn't just want to control the town, they wanted to use it as a base from which to spread their influence across the entire region, then the country, and eventually the world. They had learned from their previous mistakes and now understood that gradual, subtle changes were more effective than dramatic confrontations. The deal Nathaniel offered was simple. The consistency keepers could continue to maintain their records, and even pass them on to future generations, but they had to stop actively resisting the family's influence. In exchange, the family would limit their reality alterations to the immediate area and would not attempt to spread beyond the town's borders for at least 100 years. Agnes accepted the deal, knowing that it was the best outcome the consistency keepers could hope for, but she also knew that she was essentially trading the world's safety for her own community's survival. The Ellsworth family would continue to exist, continue to grow stronger, and eventually would spread their influence far beyond the boundaries of one small Connecticut town. Agnes Morrison's deal with the Ellsworth family held for exactly 100 years. During that time, the town existed in a state of controlled unreality, where the impossible was commonplace, but contained within specific boundaries. residents learned to accept that their reflections might not always match their actions, but people they remembered might not exist in the records, and that the past was subject to revision without notice. The consistency keepers continued their work across generations, with new members recruited from among those who showed resistance to the family's influence. They maintained their hidden records, updated them with new discoveries, and passed down the techniques for recognizing and documenting reality distortions. But they also discovered that the Ellsworth family's influence was subtly changing them as well. Children born in the town after 1940 showed an unusual ability to perceive alternate realities, often describing events that had happened in other versions of the world. Some of these children could look into mirrors and see not their own reflections, but the reflections of their alternate selves living different lives in parallel realities. Dr. Sullivan's successors documented these abilities in a series of clinical studies that were never published in mainstream medical journals. They found that prolonged exposure to reality distortion seemed to expand human consciousness in ways that were both fascinating and disturbing. Subjects could sometimes predict future events by observing the outcomes in alternate time, or solve problems by consulting with alternate versions of themselves who had different knowledge and experiences. But these abilities came with a cost. People who developed them often lost the ability to distinguish between different realities, becoming unable to determine which version of events was real and which were alternatives. They would remember multiple versions of their own lives simultaneously, creating identity confusion and psychological instability. The Ellsworth family themselves continued to evolve during this period. They became more sophisticated in their reality manipulations, learning to create changes that were so subtle and gradual that even the consistency keepers had difficulty detecting them. They also began experimenting with larger-scale alterations, briefly changing major historical events and then reverting them to test their capabilities. Robert Hayes's son, David, documented one such experiment in 1975. For a period of exactly 24 hours, the town's records showed that World War II had ended differently, with the conflict continuing until 1948 and involving different alliances. During this time, residents' memories were temporarily altered to match the new timeline, and even physical evidence was changed to support the alternate history. When the experiment ended and the original timeline was restored, most residents had no memory of the temporary change, but the consistency keepers' protected records showed that the alteration had occurred, proving that the Ellsworth family now possessed the power to rewrite history itself on a limited scale. As the centennial of Agnes Morrison's deal approached, in 2040, the current generation of consistency keepers faced a difficult decision. They could attempt to renegotiate the deal, extend it for another century, or try to find a way to eliminate the Ellsworth family permanently. But they also knew that the family had become far more powerful than they had been in 1940, and that any confrontation would likely result in complete victory for the reality parasites. By 2020, the Ellsworth family's influence had begun to extend beyond the boundaries of their original Connecticut town. Despite the terms of Agnes Morrison's century-old agreement, the proliferation of digital technology, with its countless screens and reflective surfaces, had provided them with new pathways to spread their reality distortions. Social media platforms began experiencing what tech companies initially dismissed as data anomalies: profile pictures that showed different faces depending on who was viewing them, posts that changed their content after being published, and users who insisted they had never created accounts that clearly bore their names and personal information. More disturbing still, when she compared current records with older ones, she found that the names on the population rolls were gradually changing. People she remembered from her childhood were being replaced in the records by individuals with similar but not identical names. The Morrisons became the Moransons, the Webbs became the Webbers, and the Pattersons became the Pattersons. The changes were subtle enough that most people didn't notice, but consistent enough to suggest a deliberate pattern. Agnes realized that the Ellsworth family wasn't just altering reality, they were gradually replacing it with a version of their own design. The hybrid residents weren't random amalgamations of people from different realities. They were carefully constructed individuals designed to fit into a new narrative. But the family was writing for the town. This discovery led to an even more horrifying realization. If the family could rewrite the town's population, they could potentially rewrite its entire history. They could eliminate any record of their own supernatural nature. transforming themselves in the historical record from reality parasites into ordinary citizens who had always lived in the community. Agnes shared this information with the other consistency keepers, and they made a desperate decision. They would create a complete record of the true events, hiding copies in multiple locations and using techniques designed to resist the family's reality-altering abilities. Each record would be written in a different style and stored in a different medium, making it impossible for the family to alter all of them simultaneously. Sarah Morrison wrote her account in the form of a journal, dating each entry and including specific details that could be verified against physical evidence. Dr. Sullivan created medical case files that documented the psychological effects of reality distortion, using clinical language that would be difficult to alter without making the documents obviously fraudulent. Robert Hayes compiled police reports and witness statements, organizing them chronologically to show the progression of events. Agnes Morrison took on the most dangerous task of all. She decided to confront the Ellsworth family directly, not to fight them, but to negotiate. She would offer them a deal. They could continue to exist in the town and gradually alter its reality, but they had to allow the true records to survive in some form. She would argue that they needed witnesses to their victory, people who could appreciate the scope of their achievement. Agnes arranged to meet with Nathaniel Ellsworth at the site where the church had once stood. The ground there still refused to support life, but it had become a gathering place for the hybrid residents, who would stand in a circle around the scorched earth each evening at sunset. When Agnes arrived for the meeting, she found Nathaniel waiting for her, but this wasn't the deteriorated, hollow figure that witnesses had described from the church confrontation. This Nathaniel appeared fully human, healthy and robust, wearing clothes that suggested prosperity and respectability. Only his eyes gave away his true nature. They reflected light that wasn't there, showing images of places that couldn't be seen. Agnes later wrote that Nathaniel listened to her proposal with what seemed like genuine interest. He explained that the family had indeed been working to gradually replace the town's reality with one of their own design, but that they had encountered an unexpected problem. The process was taking much longer than anticipated because the original reality was more resilient than they had expected. Nathaniel revealed that the consistency keepers' efforts had been more effective than they realized. By insisting on the truth of their memories and creating anchor points throughout the town, they had been slowing the family's progress significantly. What should have been completed in a few years was now projected to take decades. But Nathaniel also revealed something that horrified Agnes. The family didn't just want to control the town, they wanted to use it as a base from which to spread their influence across the entire region, then the country, and eventually the world. They had learned from their previous mistakes and now understood that gradual, subtle changes were more effective than dramatic confrontations. The deal Nathaniel offered was simple. The consistency keepers could continue to maintain their records, and even pass them on to future generations, but they had to stop actively resisting the family's influence. In exchange, the family would limit their reality alterations to the immediate area and would not attempt to spread beyond the town's borders for at least 100 years. Agnes accepted the deal, knowing that it was the best outcome the consistency keepers could hope for, but she also knew that she was essentially trading the world's safety for her own community's survival. The Ellsworth family would continue to exist, continue to grow stronger, and eventually would spread their influence far beyond the boundaries of one small Connecticut town. Agnes Morrison's deal with the Ellsworth family held for exactly 100 years. During that time, the town existed in a state of controlled unreality, where the impossible was commonplace but contained within specific boundaries. Residents learned to accept that their reflections might not always match their actions, but people they remembered might not exist in the records, and that the past was subject to revision without notice. The consistency keepers continued their work across generations, with new members recruited from among those who showed resistance to the family's influence. They maintained their hidden records, updated them with new discoveries, and passed down the techniques for recognizing and documenting reality distortions. But they also discovered that the Ellsworth family's influence was subtly changing them as well. Children born in the town after 1940 showed an unusual ability to perceive alternate realities, often describing events that had happened in other versions of the world. Some of these children could look into mirrors and see not their own reflections, but the reflections of their alternate selves living different lives in parallel realities. Dr. Sullivan's successors documented these abilities in a series of clinical studies that were never published in mainstream medical journals. They found that prolonged exposure to reality distortion seemed to expand human consciousness in ways that were both fascinating and disturbing. Subjects could sometimes predict future events by observing the outcomes in alternate time, or solve problems by consulting with alternate versions of themselves who had different knowledge and experiences. But these abilities came with a cost. People who developed them often lost the ability to distinguish between different realities, becoming unable to determine which version of events was real and which were alternatives. They would remember multiple versions of their own lives simultaneously, creating identity confusion and psychological instability. The Ellsworth family themselves continued to evolve during this period. They became more sophisticated in their reality manipulations, learning to create changes that were so subtle and gradual that even the consistency keepers had difficulty detecting them. They also began experimenting with larger-scale alterations, briefly changing major historical events and then reverting them to test their capabilities. Robert Hayes's son, David, documented one such experiment in 1975. For a period of exactly 24 hours, the town's records showed that World War II had ended differently, with the conflict continuing until 1948 and involving different alliances. During this time, residents' memories were temporarily altered to match the new timeline, and even physical evidence was changed to support the alternate history. When the experiment ended and the original timeline was restored, most residents had no memory of the temporary change. But the consistency keepers' protected records showed that the alteration had occurred, proving that the Ellsworth family now possessed the power to rewrite history itself on a limited scale. As the centennial of Agnes Morrison's deal approached, in 2040, the current generation of consistency keepers faced a difficult decision. They could attempt to renegotiate the deal, extend it for another century, or try to find a way to eliminate the Ellsworth family permanently. But they also knew that the family had become far more powerful than they had been in 1940, and that any confrontation would likely result in complete victory for the reality parasites. By 2020, the Ellsworth family's influence had begun to extend beyond the boundaries of their original Connecticut town. Despite the terms of Agnes Morrison's century-old agreement, the proliferation of digital technology, with its countless screens and reflective surfaces, had provided them with new pathways to spread their reality distortions. Social media platforms began experiencing what tech companies initially dismissed as data anomalies: profile pictures that showed different faces depending on who was viewing them, posts that changed their content after being published, and users who insisted they had never created accounts that clearly bore their names and personal information. Video conferencing software reported increasing numbers of users whose reflections in their computer cameras didn't match their actual appearance. These discrepancies were initially attributed to software glitches or hardware malfunctions, but the pattern was too consistent and too widespread to be explained by technical problems alone. The modern consistency keepers, now a global network communicating through encrypted channels and hidden websites, recognized these phenomena as signs that the family had broken the terms of their agreement and was beginning to spread their influence through digital mirrors. Dr. Elena Bascus, a psychiatrist and descendant of Dr. Sullivan, published the first academic paper attempting to document what she termed digital reality displacement syndrome. Her research showed that people who spent excessive amounts of time looking at screens were developing symptoms similar to those documented in the original Connecticut town: memory inconsistencies, identity confusion, and the ability to perceive alternate realities. But Dr. Vasquez's research was met with skepticism from the academic community, and several of her papers were mysteriously altered after publication to support more conventional explanations for the phenomena she described. When she attempted to present her findings at conferences, she found that her presentations would somehow become garbled or incomprehensible, as if the words themselves were being changed as she spoke them. Meanwhile, the original Connecticut town had become something unprecedented in human history, a place where multiple realities coexisted openly. Visitors to the town reported experiencing temporal displacement, where they would arrive in what appeared to be the town from decades earlier, complete with period-appropriate architecture, vehicles, and residents dressed in historical clothing. Temporal zones seemed to shift randomly throughout the town, creating a patchwork of different time periods existing simultaneously. A person could walk down Main Street and pass through the 1950s, the 1920s, the 1880s, and the present day within the span of a few blocks. The Ellsworth family themselves had become difficult to distinguish from the legitimate residents. They had learned to create perfect human disguises and had integrated themselves so thoroughly into the community that even the consistency keepers were no longer certain which residents were real and which were constructs created by the reality. Parasites. When maintenance worker Jerome Martinez made his discovery in November 2023, exactly 71 years after the previous major manifestation, he unknowingly triggered a new phase in the Ellsworth family's evolution. His photographs of the shattered mirrors and empty family portraits were uploaded to social media platforms, where they were seen by millions of people before being mysteriously removed. But the images had already begun to spread the family's influence in ways that previous generations had never experienced. People who viewed the photographs reported experiencing what they described as memory echoes, sudden recollections of events they were certain had never happened to them, involving people they didn't recognize but who seemed familiar. Dr. Michael Chen, a researcher studying digital media and its psychological effects, noticed that the photographs were causing more than just memory disturbances. People who viewed them were also reporting changes in their own reflections, seeing faces that weren't quite their own or noticing that their mirror images moved slightly out of sync with their actual movements. Dr. Chen began investigating the photographs' origins, which led him to the Connecticut town and to the descendants of the consistency keepers. What he found there challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of reality. The town had become a nexus point where dozens of alternate realities intersected, each one slightly different from the others. Residents moved freely between these realities, often unaware that they were shifting from one version of the world to another. Dr. Chen documented conversations with people who would describe completely different versions of recent events, all of which seemed equally real and valid. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Chen discovered that the Ellsworth family had been using the town as a testing ground for reality manipulation techniques that they planned to deploy on a global scale. The digital age had given them access to billions of reflective surfaces in the form of smartphone screens, computer monitors, and television displays. They were preparing to initiate what their internal documents referred to as the Great Convergence, a worldwide merging of multiple realities that would give them control over the entire planet's narrative structure. Dr. Chen's investigation revealed that the family had spent decades placing their agents in key positions within technology, companies, social media platforms, and digital communications networks. These agents, many of whom were unaware of their true nature, had been subtly modifying software and algorithms to make digital mirrors more susceptible to reality manipulation. The shattered mirrors that Jerome Martinez had found weren't evidence of the family's defeat, they were preparation for their ultimate victory. Each broken surface was designed to serve as a gateway between realities, and when activated simultaneously, they would create a global network of dimensional tiers that would allow the Ellsworth family to rewrite reality on an unprecedented scale. Dr. Chan's research, combined with intelligence gathered by the modern consistency keepers, revealed the true scope of the threat facing humanity. The Ellsworth family had evolved far beyond their original parasitic nature, becoming something closer to a collective consciousness that existed across multiple realities simultaneously. They had learned to create what Dr. Chen termed reality seeds, small distortions in the fabric of existence that would gradually expand and merge with other distortions, eventually creating zones where the family's preferred version of reality would dominate. These seeds had been planted in major cities around the world, hidden in locations with high concentrations of reflective surfaces. Shopping malls, office buildings, and subway stations had become inadvertent breeding grounds for reality distortions. People passing through these areas would experience brief moments of displacement, sudden memories of conversations that had never happened, recognition of strangers who seemed familiar, or the feeling that they were in the wrong version of their own lives. The digital component of the family's plan was even more ambitious. By infiltrating social media algorithms and search engines, they had begun to subtly alter the information that billions of people accessed daily. Historical facts were gradually being changed, with the modifications so small and incremental that most people didn't notice them. But the cumulative effect was to make reality itself seem less stable and reliable. Dr. Elena Baskus, working with Dr. Chen and the consistency keepers, discovered that the family's ultimate goal was to create a world where multiple versions of reality coexisted openly, with themselves as the arbiters of which version would be considered real at any given moment. They would become the editors of human experience, able to revise history, alter memories, and reshape reality according to their desires. The plan was scheduled to begin on November 15, 2025, exactly 200 years after the first Ellsworth family had disappeared from their Connecticut home. On that date, every reflective surface on Earth that had been prepared by the family's agents would simultaneously activate, creating a global network of dimensional gateways. The initial phase would last exactly 25 years, mirroring the family's traditional cycle but on a planetary scale. During this time, reality would gradually become more fluid and unstable, with parallel versions of events occurring simultaneously and people losing their ability to distinguish between different timelines. By 2050, the family intended to have complete control over humanity's perception of reality. They would be able to edit the past to remove any record of their supernatural nature, making themselves appear to have always been benevolent leaders who had guided humanity's development throughout history. But the most horrifying aspect of their plan was what would happen to human consciousness itself. Dr. Vasquez's research suggested that prolonged exposure to reality manipulation would fundamentally alter the human brain's ability to process information. People would lose their capacity for independent thought and critical analysis, becoming dependent on external sources to determine what was real and what wasn't. Humanity would, in effect, become a species of sleepwalkers, going through the motions of civilization while having no real agency or awareness. The Ellsworth family would have achieved the perfect symbiotic relationship, a world full of beings who could provide them with the narrative consistency they needed to survive, while being unable to resist or even recognize their parasitic influence. As the November 15, 2025 deadline approached, the global network of consistency keepers faced the most important challenge in their organization's history. They had less than 2 years to find a way to prevent or disrupt the Ellsworth family's plan for worldwide reality manipulation. Dr. Chen and Dr. Vasquez established a research center in a remote location far from any major population centers, hoping to minimize the family's influence on their work. They were joined by scientists, historians, and researchers from around the world, all of whom had encountered evidence of reality distortion in their own fields. The team's first breakthrough came when they discovered that the Ellsworth family's power had a fundamental weakness. It required consensus to function effectively. The reality parasites could only alter events and memories when most observers accepted the changes as legitimate. If enough people maintained awareness of the original reality and actively rejected the alterations, the distortions would become unstable and eventually collapse. This discovery led to the development of what the team called Reality Anchoring Protocol, a set of techniques for maintaining clear memories and resisting reality manipulation. The protocol involved regular verification of personal memories against physical evidence, creation of redundant records stored in multiple formats, and the establishment of anchor groups, small teams of people who would verify each other's experiences and help maintain consistency of perception. The team also developed technology designed to detect and counteract reality distortions. Special cameras were created that could capture images across multiple dimensional frequencies, revealing the true nature of spaces that had been altered by the Ellsworth family. Audio recording equipment was modified to pick up temporal echoes, sounds from alternate realities that were bleeding through dimensional tiers. Most importantly, they created what they called mirror nullifiers, devices that could disrupt the Ellsworth family's ability to use reflective surfaces as gateways between realities. These devices worked by generating specific light frequencies that interfered with the dimensional properties of mirrors and other reflective materials. But as the team worked to develop countermeasures, they faced increasing interference from sources they couldn't identify. Their research data would mysteriously become corrupted, their communications would be intercepted and altered, and team members would sometimes arrive at work with no memory of the previous day's discoveries. Dr. Chen realized that the family was actively working to sabotage their efforts, using reality manipulation to eliminate evidence and alter memories. The team was forced to implement extreme security measures, working in isolation and using analog recording methods that were harder for the family to alter. They also discovered that they were not alone in their resistance efforts. Around the world, small groups of people had spontaneously begun documenting reality distortions and developing their own countermeasures. These groups had emerged independently, suggesting that human consciousness itself was developing an immune response to the family's influence. That as 2024 progressed, the signs of the approaching convergence became increasingly obvious to those who knew what to look for. Reality distortions were occurring with greater frequency and intensity, affecting larger numbers of people and lasting for longer periods. Major news events would be reported differently by various media outlets, not due to bias or error, but because the events themselves were occurring differently in parallel realities. Social media posts would change their content after being published, and people would find themselves having memories of conversations and experiences that contradicted their friends and family members. Recollections, the Ellsworth family themselves, became more visible during this period, appearing openly in their original Connecticut town and even granting interviews to journalists who were investigating the increasingly frequent reality anomalies. But these interviews would invariably become confused and contradictory, with the reporters finding themselves unable to remember clearly what had been discussed. Nathaniel Ellsworth, now appearing as a distinguished elderly gentleman who claimed to be a local historian, spoke to Dr. Chen in one of these interviews. People are so concerned about reality being changed, but they don't understand that reality has always been fluid. What we're offering is simply a more honest acknowledgement of that fact. Instead of pretending that there's only one true version of events, we're allowing all versions to coexist. Isn't that more democratic, more inclusive? When Dr. Chen asked about the psychological effects on humans who were exposed to multiple realities simultaneously, Nathaniel's response was chilling. Adaptation is the key to survival. Those who can't adapt to the new paradigm will find their place in the reflected world, where they can be happy and peaceful. Those who can adapt will discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. Either way, humanity will be better for the experience. The interview ended abruptly when Dr. Chen's recording equipment began malfunctioning, capturing images and sounds that didn't match what was happening in the room. When he reviewed the footage later, he found that it showed not his interview with Nathaniel, but a conversation with an empty chair in a room that looked similar to but subtly different from the one where the interview had taken place. As November 15, 2025 approached, the Global Consistency Keeper Network put their countermeasures into place. Mirror nullifiers were secretly installed in major cities around the world. Reality anchoring protocols were distributed through encrypted channels, and teams of observers were positioned at key locations to document and resist the convergence. But they also knew that their efforts might not be enough. The Ellsworth family had been planning this operation for over 2 centuries, and they had demonstrated an ability to adapt and overcome obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. The battle for reality itself was about to begin, and the outcome would determine the future of human consciousness. At exactly 12:01 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on November 15, 2025, every reflective surface that had been prepared by the Ellsworth family's agents activated simultaneously. The effect was immediately noticeable to anyone who was paying attention. Mirrors, windows, smartphone screens, and even puddles of water began showing reflections that didn't match their surroundings. Dr. Chan, monitoring the situation from the Resistance Command Center, watched as reports flooded in from around the world. In Tokyo, commuters waiting for trains found themselves looking at subway platforms from decades in the past. In London, shoppers in department stores saw reflections of themselves in Victorian-era clothing. In New York City, the windows of skyscrapers showed not the city outside, but vast empty plains under alien skies. The initial phase of the convergence was subtle but pervasive. People would catch glimpses of alternate versions of their lives in reflective surfaces, seeing themselves in different careers, different relationships, different circumstances. At first, most observers dismissed these as hallucinations or tricks of the light, but as the hours passed, the visions became more persistent and detailed. By noon, reality distortions were occurring openly and undeniably. Streets would suddenly be filled with people dressed in period clothing from various historical eras, all existing simultaneously and interacting as if this were perfectly normal. Buildings would shift architectural styles while people were looking at them, transforming from modern structures to Victorian mansions to medieval castles and back again. The Ellsworth family appeared in major cities around the world, no longer bothering to maintain their human disguises. They moved through the chaos with confidence and purpose, directing the reality distortions and ensuring that the convergence proceeded according to their plan. Nathaniel Ellsworth manifested in Times Square, his true form revealed as a towering figure made of fractured mirror, glass and shadow. He spoke to the crowds of confused and terrified people, his voice echoing from every reflective surface in the area. Welcome to the new reality. You are witnessing the end of the tyranny of singular truth and the beginning of infinite possibility. Do not resist the change, embrace it, and discover the freedom that comes from living in all possible worlds simultaneously. But the resistance was ready. Consistency Keeper teams activated their mirror nullifiers in coordinated strikes, creating zones of stable reality within the chaos. These zones served as anchor points, spaces where the original timeline remained dominant and where people could retreat to regain their sense of what was real. Dr. Vasquez, leading a team in Washington, D.C., reported that the nullifiers were having an effect but were being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the convergence. The Ellsworth family had prepared far more extensively than the resistance had anticipated, with backup systems and redundant reality distortion generators hidden throughout every major city. The battle for reality raged throughout the day, with success and failure measured not in territory gained or lost, but in the stability of causality itself. In some areas, the resistance managed to maintain baseline reality, keeping the world recognizably consistent with its pre-convergent state. In others, the Ellsworth family's influence created zones of fluid reality where anything was possible, and nothing was certain. As night fell on November 5th, it became clear that neither side had achieved complete victory. The world had been irrevocably changed, but it had not been completely conquered. Reality had become a contested space, with pockets of stability surrounded by areas of constant flux. That in the months following the convergence, humanity began to adapt to life in a world where reality was no longer singular or stable. Some people thrived in the new environment, developing the ability to navigate between alternate realities and access knowledge and experiences from parallel versions of their lives. Others found the constant uncertainty unbearable and retreated to the stability zones maintained by the Consistency Keepers. The Ellsworth family had achieved partial success, but not the complete victory they had planned. Their influence was widespread but not absolute, and they found themselves engaged in an ongoing struggle with human resistance rather than ruling over a compliant population. Dr. Chen established a new research institute dedicated to studying and documenting the post-convergence world. His team discovered that reality had become layered, with multiple timelines existing simultaneously but at different levels of accessibility. People could sometimes slip between these layers, experiencing alternate versions of events or meeting alternate versions of themselves. The psychological effects were profound and varied. Some individuals developed what Dr. Vasquez termed reality fluidity, the ability to maintain their sense of identity and purpose while experiencing multiple, conflicting realities. Others suffered from temporal displacement syndrome, becoming lost between timelines and unable to determine which version of their life was authentic. Children born after the convergence showed remarkable adaptability to the new reality structure. They grew up accepting that the world contained multiple possible versions of events and developed intuitive abilities to navigate between different timelines. These children often served as bridges between adults who were struggling to cope with the new reality. The Ellsworth family, meanwhile, had been changed by their partial victory. They had gained more power than ever before, but they had also become more distributed and less cohesive. Different family members now existed primarily in different reality layers, and their interests and goals had begun to diverge. Martha Ellsworth had become obsessed with artistic expression, using reality manipulation to create impossible sculptures and paintings that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The children, Thomas and Elizabeth, had developed into something like benevolent guides, helping lost travelers navigate between realities. Only Nathaniel remained focused on the original goal of total reality control, but his power had been diminished by the Resistance's efforts. As I compiled this investigation in mid-2025, the story of the Ellsworth family remains unfinished. The convergence created a new type of world, one where the impossible has become commonplace and where the nature of reality itself is constantly in question. The Consistency Keepers continue their work, now operating openly as guardians of baseline reality. They maintain the stability zones, help people cope with reality displacement, and document the ongoing changes to our world. Their mission has evolved from resistance to adaptation, helping humanity find ways to thrive in a reality that refuses to remain constant. Dr. Chen's research has revealed that the convergence was not an ending but a beginning. The barriers between realities have been permanently weakened, and new forms of existence are emerging that were never possible before. Some of these developments are beneficial. Medical conditions that exist in one reality can sometimes be cured by accessing treatments from alternate time. Others are dangerous criminals and malevolent entities from darker realities, have begun crossing over into our world. The Ellsworth family themselves have become something like a force of nature, present everywhere but controllable nowhere. They continue to influence reality, but their power is now balanced by human resistance and the natural tendency of the universe to seek stability. Perhaps most importantly, humanity has begun to develop new capabilities in response to the changed reality. Children born post-convergence show enhanced pattern recognition, improved memory consolidation, and an intuitive understanding of quantum probability that allows them to make choices that optimize outcomes across multiple timelines. We are becoming something new, something that the Ellsworth family never anticipated. They sought to make us dependent on their reality manipulation, but instead they have forced us to evolve beyond our previous limitations. The macabre history of the Ellsworth family spans over 2 centuries, but it may be that their greatest impact on humanity is still to come. They have shown us that reality is not fixed, that the world we experience is only one of countless possibilities. Whether this knowledge will ultimately benefit or destroy us remains to be seen. What is certain is that we can never go back to the simple, singular reality we once knew. The mirrors will never again show only what stands before them. The reflections have taken on lives of their own, and we must learn to live in a world where every surface might be a window to somewhere else entirely. The investigation continues, because in a world of infinite realities, there are always new mysteries to uncover. The Ellsworth family may have won their war against singular truth, but they have also ensured that their story will never truly end. In every reflection, in every photograph that shows empty spaces where faces should be, in every moment when reality seems just slightly wrong, their legacy continues. And somewhere, in the spaces between what is and what might be, they are still watching, still waiting, still reflecting their impossible existence into our world, one mirror at a time. The truth about the Ellsworth family is that there is no single truth. There are only stories, told and retold across multiple realities, each version slightly different but all of them real in their own way. This account is one such story, documented as thoroughly as possible in a world where thorough documentation has become impossible. But perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the important thing is not to capture the complete truth, but to bear witness to the impossibility we now inhabit, to remember that once, reality was simple and singular, and to document how we learned to live when it became anything but. The mirrors still show no reflection of the Ellsworth faces, but now, we understand that this is because they are the reflections, looking back at us from the other side of the glass, waiting for their turn to step into the light.